The first frost of autumn had already touched the gravel drive at Ashworth Hall when the stranger came through the gates on foot. He carried no trunk and wore no cravat, and the greatcoat hanging from his shoulders was of a cut no London tailor would have claimed. Clara Whitmore saw him from the morning-room window, where she had been mending the hem of a curtain the household could not afford to replace. She set down her needle. The man moved with a limp that favored his left side, and his hair, dark and longer than fashion permitted, fell across a face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the hinge of his jaw. The footman at the door did not know him. Mrs. Yarrow, the housekeeper, did not know him. The two maids who had gathered in the entrance hall at the sound of gravel under unfamiliar boots did not know him. Clara knew him. She knew him by the way he held his right hand slightly open at his side, as though reaching for something no longer there, and by the angle of his shoulders when he stopped at the threshold and looked up at the plasterwork above the door, the Drayton crest he had not seen in 7 years. She set her hand against the doorframe of the morning room and felt the wood press into her palm, because her breath had stopped and her body needed something solid to hold. The Earl of Ashworth had come home. If his name has already caught you, stay close. His story, and hers, is only beginning. No one in the hall spoke his name. The footman asked his business, and Julian Drayton, 7th Earl of Ashworth, who had left this house at 19 with blood on his riding gloves and his mother's voice still raw in his ears, said only that he wished to see Lady Georgiana. His voice had changed. It was lower than Clara remembered, and flatter, as though the music had been taken out of it and replaced with something that did not bend. The footman hesitated. Mrs. Yarrow stepped forward, her face pale, her hands clasped at her waist in the posture she adopted when the household required her steadiness more than her warmth. It was Clara who crossed the hall. She stopped 3 paces from him, close enough to see the scar in its full geography, the way it disappeared into his collar, the way his jaw tightened when he saw her looking at it. She said his name, not his title, not my lord, not sir. She said, Julian. And his face, which had carried the careful stillness of a man who expected nothing from the place he had returned to, shifted by 1 degree. The skin around his eyes softened. His right hand, the one that had been reaching, closed. Lady Georgiana descended the staircase 11 minutes later, dressed in plum silk, her hair dressed, her composure intact. She looked at the man standing in her entrance hall and did not recognize her own son. Clara watched her study him, watched the flicker of distaste at the scar, the limp, the absence of a proper coat, the mud on his boots. She watched Lady Georgiana's chin lift by a fraction, the precise fraction that preceded a dismissal. It was Mrs. Yarrow who murmured it. My lady, it is Lord Ashworth. The silence that followed had a texture. It pressed against the walls. Lady Georgiana's hand found the banister, and her gloved fingers tightened around it until the kid leather creased. And she said, in a voice that carried no warmth and no welcome, You had better come into the drawing room. She did not embrace him. She did not say his name. She turned on the stair and walked back the way she had come. And Julian followed her with the careful gait of a man whose left leg had learned to compensate for what it could no longer do. And Clara stood in the hall with her mending needle still threaded through the curtain hem in the morning room behind her, and understood that the house she had held together for 2 years had just been cracked open at its foundation. Clara Whitmore was the steward's daughter, and she had been the steward's daughter for so long that the phrase had become less a description than a sentence. Her father, George Whitmore, had served the old earl for 23 years, had kept the books and the tenants and the drainage and the fences in a condition that the Draytons accepted as natural, the way one accepts that the sun produces light. When the old earl died and Julian left and Lady Georgiana assumed control of the household and the estate, with the confidence of a woman who believed management was a matter of will rather than skill. George Whitmore had stayed. He stayed through the first bad harvest. He stayed through the second. He stayed through the winter when the west roof leaked, and the Dowager refused the repair because the money had gone to Sophia Langley's wardrobe, because Miss Langley was to be the future countess if Julian could be found and brought to heel. Or if not Julian, then some cousin from the Drayton line who could be made to see the advantage. George Whitmore stayed until his heart stopped in the study one February morning, a pen still in his hand, the quarterly account still open on the desk, the ink not yet dry on the last figure he would ever write. Clara had found him. She had closed the book. She had washed the pen. And she had stayed. She stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and because the tenants still needed someone who knew which fields drained and which did not, and because Mrs. Yarrow was 61 and could not manage alone, and because the house, for all its fraying, was the only place her father's presence still lived in the grain of the desk, the annotation in the margin of the ledger, the careful handwriting on the map of the south pasture. She rose each morning before the household and walked the grounds in the gray half-light, checking the fence posts her father had driven, the sluice gate on the lower pasture, the stable door whose hinge she oiled herself every fortnight because the blacksmith had not been paid in 6 months. She kept the kitchen garden because the cook required it. She kept the household accounts because no one else could read her father's system. She kept the tenants' trust because she answered their letters when Lady Georgiana did not. And she signed them with her own name, because using the family's name without permission would have been a liberty the Dowager would not have forgiven. Lady Georgiana tolerated her because Clara was useful and cheap, and because dismissing her would have required finding a replacement who understood the drainage. She is the steward's daughter, nothing more, Lady Georgiana had said to Sophia Langley over tea in the small parlor, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the doorway where Clara stood with a tray of fresh linen. A competent creature, I grant you. One does not dismiss a competent creature when one has use for her. Sophia had sipped her tea and said nothing, which was her particular skill, the skill of a woman who had been groomed since girlhood to occupy a position that required beauty, compliance, and the willingness to be arranged. Clara set down the linen and left the room, and did not permit her face to change until she reached the kitchen stairs, where she pressed her back against the cold plaster and held very still until the heat in her throat subsided. Julian's return altered the geometry of every room. He did not announce himself as the Earl. He did not summon the household. He sat in the drawing room with his mother for 40 minutes, and when he emerged, he walked the ground floor of Ashworth Hall, the way a man walks through a house he has dreamed about so many times that the real version startles him with its smaller scale. Clara watched him stop at the door of his father's study, now his study, and press his palm flat against the wood without opening it. She watched him stand at the window of the long gallery and look out at the south pasture, where the fence her father had last repaired still held. She watched him favor his left leg more heavily as the afternoon wore on, and she watched him refuse the chair Mrs. Yarrow offered, and remain standing because sitting would have meant admitting the pain, and he was not yet willing to admit anything in this house that had taught him to keep silent. She brought him tea without being asked. He looked at her when she set it on the hall table, and his gaze stayed for a beat longer than the transaction required. "You are George Whitmore's daughter," he said. Not a question. A recognition. She said, "I am." He picked up the cup. His hand, she noticed, had new scars across the knuckles, pale and ridged, the kind that came from work or from fists, and the signet ring he had worn at 19 was absent from his finger. He was a good man, Julian said, his voice level and low. I should have written when I heard. Clara nodded, because the words she might have said would have cost more than this moment could carry, and she left the room before her composure failed. And behind her, she heard the cup set down on the saucer with a steadiness that told her he had watched her go. That evening she went to her room, the small chamber above the kitchen that had been hers since her father's death, and opened the wooden box on the nightstand. Inside, wrapped in a square of linen, lay a brass compass the size of a half-crown. It had belonged to Thomas Drayton, Julian's younger brother, who had been 15 when he died. Thomas had carried it in his coat pocket every day of the last summer of his life, the summer he spent following Julian to the stables, to the river, to the ridge above the south pasture where you could see 3 counties if the air was clear. Clara had found the compass in the stable straw the morning after the accident, after the horse had been led away, and the stall scrubbed, and the household sealed shut around its grief like a wound closing over something still inside. She had kept it. She had not known why, except that Thomas had been kind to her when kindness from the family was not required, and the compass had been warm from his pocket, and throwing it away would have meant agreeing that he was entirely gone. She held it now in her palm, and felt its weight. The faint click of the needle still finding north after 7 years, and she closed her fingers around it, and sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about the boy who had saddled the horse, and the man who had come home with a scar, and a limp, and a voice emptied of music. And she understood that they were the same person, and that no one in this house would see it except her. The next morning, Julian found Clara in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the cold soil, pulling the last of the season's carrots. He stood at the gate for longer than he needed to. She felt his presence the way she felt a shift in weather, a change in the pressure of the air against her skin, and she did not look up until she had finished the row, because looking up too soon would have told him something she was not ready to have told. When she stood and brushed the earth from her hands, he was leaning against the gate-post with his arms folded and his weight on his right leg, and his face wore the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of stillness, the mask he had built over whatever moved beneath it. "You have kept the garden," he said. "Your mother dismissed the gardener 2 years ago," Clara said. "Someone had too." He looked at the rows, carrots, parsnips, the last of the beans still drying on their stakes. His jaw shifted, the muscle tightening at the hinge where the scar ended, and he said, "Come inside. It is too cold for this." The command landed in the air between them. Clara felt it as a pressure against her sternum, the particular pressure of being told to stop by someone whose voice carried authority he had not yet claimed aloud, and she gathered the carrots into her basket and walked past him through the gate, close enough that her sleeve brushed his folded arm, and the brush sent a warmth up through her wrist that she carried into the kitchen like a stolen thing. That afternoon, Julian witnessed what the house did not see. Clara did not know he was there. She was in the servants' hall, standing across the long table from Lady Georgiana's lady's maid, a woman named Fletcher, whose authority over the lower household was an extension of the dowager's own. Fletcher had dismissed the kitchen girl, a child of 14 named Polly, for spilling cider on the linen cupboard floor. And Polly was standing in the doorway with her cap in her hands, and her face raw from crying. Clara said, "Polly stays." Her voice was not raised. It was level and quiet in the way that Julian's own voice was level and quiet, the way that people speak when they have decided something, and the decision is not open to renegotiation. "She has been here 9 months. She works the morning fires and the evening wash, and she has not missed a day. A spilled cup is a spilled cup." Fletcher looked at Clara the way a woman looks at another woman whose authority she does not recognize, and Clara looked back, and the silence between them lasted 4 seconds, and Fletcher turned and left the servants' hall without another word. Polly sat down in the nearest chair and pressed her cap against her face, and Clara put her hand on the child's shoulder, briefly, the touch of someone who remembered what it was to be 14 and afraid in a house that did not belong to her. Julian stood in the corridor behind the half-open door and did not speak. His hand was at his breast pocket, where the compass was not yet. And his face held the expression Clara would later learn to read as the moment when something closed opens by a fraction, against its own intention. Later that same afternoon, Julian was in the study, the door half open, and Clara was passing through the corridor when she heard Sophia's voice, high and certain. Lady Georgiana feels the girl has overstepped her position, Sophia was saying. She manages the household as though it were her own. A pause. Then Julian's voice, low and even. Which girl? Not a question. A correction. Miss Whitmore, Sophia said, the name carrying the faintest edge of disdain. The steward's daughter. There it was. The second voicing, placed now in a different mouth, carried across the threshold of a room where power had shifted, and no one yet understood how far. Julian said nothing for a long moment. Clara heard the creak of the chair, the sound of him standing, the uneven weight of his step as he crossed to the window. Miss Whitmore stays, he said. She appears to be the only person in this house who knows how it works. Sophia left the study 2 minutes later, her color high, her fan pressed against her palm as though she needed something to grip, and she did not see Clara standing in the shadow of the corridor, and Clara did not move until the click of Sophia's shoes on the flagstone had faded into the west wing. 3 days after Julian's return, Lady Georgiana held a dinner. She invited the rector, Sir Harold Pelham from the neighboring estate, his wife, and 2 families from the county whose attendance confirmed that the Earl of Ashworth's return was now a matter of public interest rather than private scandal. Clara was not invited to sit. She was asked to oversee the service, a task that placed her in the dining room in the posture of a servant, visible to every guest, positioned at the sideboard where the decanters stood. Lady Georgiana sat at the head of the table with the composure of a woman who had held this seat for 7 years and did not intend to relinquish it simply because her son had limped through the front door. Julian sat at the far end, silent for the first 2 courses, his face still, his wine glass untouched. Sophia sat beside him in pale blue silk, her hair dressed with seed pearls, her hand resting on the tablecloth at a distance from his that was calculated to suggest proximity without presumption. The conversation turned, as it always turned in this county, to the question of the estate, and Lady Georgiana said, in a voice pitched to reach every ear at the table, "You must forgive Miss Whitmore if the service is uneven this evening. She is only the steward's daughter, after all, and we have asked rather more of her than her station warrants." The table was quiet. Sir Harold's wife looked at her plate. Clara's hand, holding the decanter, did not tremble, because she had learned 2 years ago that trembling in front of Lady Georgiana was a currency she could not afford to spend. She poured the wine. She set the decanter down. She looked at no one, and no one looked at her, except Julian, whose eyes found hers across the length of the table and held for 3 full seconds, which in the grammar of that room was an act so conspicuous that Lady Georgiana's next sentence faltered before it began. After the guests had gone, Clara climbed the kitchen stairs and sat on the top step in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight against the wall, and allowed herself 5 minutes of the feeling she had been holding at bay since the decanter. Shame. Not for what she was, not for her father or her work or her station, which she could defend and had defended and would defend again. Shame for the fact that the defense was still required, that after 2 years of keeping this house from falling into the mud, the phrase "only the steward's daughter" could still land in her chest like a stone dropped from a height. She heard the step before she saw him. The uneven gait, the heavier fall on the right foot, the pause at the bottom of the stairs. Julian stood in the kitchen corridor with his coat removed and his shirt sleeves turned to the elbow, and he looked up at her sitting on the top step, and he said, "Eat something." She stared at him. "Mrs. Yarrow left a plate in the kitchen," he said. "You did not eat tonight." The command again. The protection folded inside it like a letter folded inside an envelope, the meaning pressed against the outside of the words, waiting for someone to open it. Clara stood and descended the stairs, and as she passed him, he stepped back to give her room. And in the stepping back, his hand found the wall and the sleeve of his shirt pulled against his forearm, and she saw, for the first time, the full extent of the scarring there, the pale ropes of healed tissue that ran from his wrist to his elbow. And she understood that whatever had happened to Julian Drayton in the 7 years since he had left this house, it had been written on his body in a language she could not yet read. She ate the plate Mrs. Yarrow had left. He stood at the kitchen window with his back to her and said nothing. And the silence between them held a weight that was not absence, that was not discomfort. That was the particular weight of two people who had each survived a version of the same house and were only now discovering that survival is easier to carry when someone else has carried it too. The wound opened 4 days later in the study, at dusk. Clara had brought him the compass. She had wrapped it again in its square of linen and set it on the desk without explanation, because explanation would have required her to say Thomas's name, and she did not know whether Julian could hear it yet. He looked at the compass for a long time. He picked it up. The brass was warm from her keeping, and the needle turned and settled, and he pressed his thumb across the face of it, the way a man presses his thumb across a photograph of someone he has lost. "I saddled the horse," he said. His voice was level. The flatness she had learned was not calm, was something closer to the sound a man makes when he has rehearsed a sentence so many times that the feeling has been pressed out of it, like water from cloth. "Thomas asked me to saddle Dovetail because the groom was gone for the day, and I was in a hurry, and I did not check the girth properly, and the saddle slipped at the canter, and he fell." He set the compass down. His hand stayed beside it, his fingers open, as though he could not decide whether to hold it or push it away. "My mother told me I had killed him. She was standing in the stable yard, and the groom had come back, and Thomas was on the ground. And she said, 'Julian, you have killed your brother.' She said it as a fact, the way one says it is raining." Clara did not touch him. She did not cross the desk. She stood where she was and let the words fall into the room and settle there, because she understood that comfort offered too quickly becomes a door that closes over the thing that needs to stay open. If this moment has found something in you, if you have ever stood in a room where someone finally said the thing they had carried alone for years, you already know why Clara did not move. What came next changed everything. His face, the face she had known at 19, and now struggled to find beneath the scar and the stillness, shifted. Not a collapse. Something quieter. The mask thinning until she could see, for one unguarded breath, the boy who had knelt in the stable straw with his brother's head in his hands, and then it was gone, and he was the Earl again, and he picked up the compass and placed it in his breast pocket, and he said, "Thank you for keeping this." Clara nodded. She left the room. In the corridor, she pressed her hand flat against the wall and closed her eyes and felt her pulse in her throat, heavy and quick. And she knew that she was in a kind of danger that had nothing to do with her station, and everything to do with the fact that her body had decided something her mind had not yet been given permission to name. The catastrophe came the following week. At a gathering, Lady Georgiana had arranged to introduce Sophia to the wider county as the woman she intended Julian to marry. The drawing room was full. The candles had been lit. Sophia stood at Lady Georgiana's right hand in ivory silk, her composure immaculate, her smile steady. Clara was not present. She had been told that morning that her services were no longer required. Lady Georgiana had summoned her to the small parlor and delivered the sentence with the same measured calm with which she seasoned every cruelty. "I have heard from Mrs. Pelham that you have been seen walking alone with the Earl," she said. "I have heard from Miss Langley that you presume to manage his correspondence. I have heard from Mrs. Croft that the steward's daughter fancies herself the lady of the house." The third voicing, delivered not as Lady Georgiana's own words this time, placed in the mouths of witnesses, carried across the room as evidence. "You will pack your things tonight and leave tomorrow morning. I have arranged a position for you in Exeter. A family there requires a governess. You will go." Clara stood in the parlor with her hands at her sides and felt the floor tilt beneath her, not because the dismissal surprised her, not because she had not expected it, only because the last 2 years had taught her that usefulness was protection, and she had believed, foolishly, that being needed would be enough. She did not beg. She did not argue. She said, "I understand." And she turned and left the room and climbed the kitchen stairs to her chamber and took out her father's old valise and began, very carefully, to fold the few things she owned into it. She placed the compass on the desk in the study while Julian was at dinner. She placed it on the blotter where he would find it, its brass face catching the last of the evening light. And she did not leave a note, because the compass said everything a note could say, and said it without words. The gathering was in its second hour, when Clara descended the main staircase with her valise. She had not intended to pass through the entrance hall. The back stairs led to the kitchen door, and the kitchen door led to the lane, and the lane would have taken her to the coach road without the necessity of being seen. She took the main stairs because Mrs. Yarrow had left her cloak in the front hall closet, and because retrieving it through the servants' passage would have required passing the kitchen, where Mrs. Yarrow would have seen her leaving, and would have wept, and Clara could not bear to be wept over tonight. She was halfway down the staircase when the drawing-room doors opened, and the candlelight and the murmur of voices spilled into the hall, and Julian stepped through them. He stopped. He saw the valise. He saw her cloak over her arm. He saw the set of her jaw, which was the set of a woman who had decided something and would not be moved from it. And his face changed. The stillness broke. She saw it fracture along the line of the scar, saw his mouth open and close, saw his hand reach for the doorframe the way her hand had reached for the doorframe the morning he arrived, because something had shifted inside the structure of the hall, and they both needed something solid to hold. "Where are you going?" he said. His voice was not level. It was not low and flat and emptied of music. It was the voice of a man who had just found the compass on his desk and understood what its placement meant. Clara said, "Your mother has dismissed me. There is a position in Exeter." She said it plainly, the way her father would have said it, the facts laid out without ornament, because ornament was a luxury she could not afford. Not now. Not with the drawing room full of people who had spent the evening being shown the woman Lady Georgiana had chosen for him. Julian's jaw set. The muscle at the scar's hinge tightened. He turned and walked back through the drawing-room doors, and Clara heard his uneven step cross the floor, and she heard the conversation stop, and she heard the silence that is not absence. That is the sound of an entire room turning to face a single man. She followed him to the doorway. She did not know why. Her valise was in her hand, and the front door was behind her, and the coach road was an hour's walk, and the position in Exeter was real, and the life it offered was small and safe, and entirely without the particular danger of standing in a room with Julian Drayton. She followed him because her body had decided something, and for once she did not overrule it. She stood in the doorway of the drawing room and saw what the room saw. Julian, standing in the center of the floor, his limp visible, his scar visible, his shirt sleeve still turned to the elbow because he had left his coat somewhere and had not gone back for it. Lady Georgiana at the far end, her face white, her hand on Sophia's arm. Sir Harold Pelham and his wife near the fire, the rector by the window. 12 other faces, the faces of the county, turned toward the Earl of Ashworth, with the particular attentiveness of people who can feel the air in a room changing, and do not yet know what it will become. Julian looked at his mother. He looked at Sophia, whose composure held, whose eyes were steady, whose hand on the arm of her chair was the only sign that she understood what was about to happen. He looked at the room, and then he turned, and he looked at Clara standing in the doorway with her valise, and he crossed the floor in 4 strides, his limp carrying a rhythm the room could hear, each step landing with the weight of a choice already made. He stopped in front of her. He took the valise from her hand and set it on the floor. The silence held. He said, in a voice that carried to every corner, to every ear, to the rector, and to Sir Harold, and to Sophia, and to his mother, whose hand had left its grip on Sophia's arm and now hung at her side like something severed. Miss Whitmore is to be my wife. The room did not gasp. The room held. The rector's hand closed around his glass. Sir Harold's wife looked at her husband. Sophia Langley lowered her eyes to her lap and sat very still, and her face, which had been composed, became something quieter, something that looked like recognition, as though she had always known the arrangement was a frame without a painting, and was only now being shown the wall where it had hung. Lady Georgiana spoke. "You cannot," she said, and her voice had lost its calibration, had lost the measured evenness that was its power, and the words came out clipped and unfinished. "She is the steward's daughter. She is nothing. You cannot." Julian did not raise his voice. He did not match her cruelty. He turned to her and said quietly, with the same level tone he used for commands that were functionally protection, "She kept your house, Mother. She kept your tenants. She kept my brother's compass when the rest of you let him disappear. She is not nothing." Mr. Paget, the family solicitor, who had been standing near the door in the posture of a man waiting to be needed, stepped forward. He held a leather case. He opened it and produced a document, the confirmation of Julian's identity and authority, the seal of the Lord Chancellor's office visible at the margin, and he said, in a voice trained for rooms exactly like this one, "The Earl of Ashworth is fully restored to his title and estates. His authority over the household and its arrangements is complete." Lady Georgiana sat down. She did not choose to sit. Her knees chose for her, and the chair received her, and her hands found each other in her lap and held on. Sophia rose and crossed the room and paused at the door, and as she passed Clara, she said, very quietly, so that only Clara heard, "He always looked at you, even when we were young, even then." And she left, and the room began, slowly, to breathe again, and Mrs. Yarrow, standing at the edge of the hallway with her apron twisted in her hands, wept the tears Clara had hoped to spare her. That night the house was quiet, in a way it had not been quiet in 7 years. Clara sat in the study, in the chair across from the desk, with the fire low and the candles down to their last inch. Julian sat behind the desk with the compass open in his palm, the brass catching the amber light, the needle still pointing north. He had not spoken much since the drawing room. He had seen the guests out. He had stood in the entrance hall while Mr. Paget explained the documents, and Mrs. Yarrow brought tea, and Lady Georgiana remained in the drawing room with the door closed and the lights still burning. Now it was late, and the house had settled around them the way a house settles after a storm, with small creaks and sighs, the timber remembering its shape. Julian looked at Clara across the desk. "I should have come back sooner," he said. Clara shook her head. "You came back," she said. "That is enough." He stood and came around the desk and stopped in front of her chair, and he said her name. "Not Miss Whitmore. Clara." The syllables deliberate, weighted, placed in the room the way a hand is placed on a table when a man wants to show that it is steady. "Clara." She looked up at him. His face was close, and the scar was a line of pale silver in the firelight. And his eyes, which had been smoke and stone and stillness for every day since his return, were open. She could see the boy. She could see the man. She could see the space between them. The 7 years, and the war, and the guilt, and the riding accident, and the mother's voice in the stable yard. And she could see that he had carried all of it back through the front door of Ashworth Hall and set it down, piece by piece, in the rooms where it had started, and that the compass in his hand was the last piece, and he was offering it to her. She took it. The brass was warm. The needle turned and settled. Julian's hand covered hers, and the touch was not a kiss, was not a declaration, was the simple pressure of one palm over another with a compass between them. And it held everything that the drawing room had not permitted, and the study, in its quiet, could. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun. Clara could see it through the window behind him, white against the dark, falling on the gravel drive where he had arrived on foot with no trunk, and no cravat, and no expectation of welcome. The fire shifted. A log settled. The compass needle held true beneath their joined hands. Snow fell on Ashworth Hall, on the south pasture her father had mapped, on the stable where Thomas's horse had once stood, on the kitchen garden she had kept through 2 winters, on the roof that leaked, and the fence that held, and the threshold Julian had crossed to come home. She closed her fingers around the compass and felt its weight, small and certain, pointing north in the dark. And she knew that this, finally, was the house she had been keeping all along. "Thank you for staying until the end. If Clara's quiet kept you here, leave a word for her before you go."